Okay. Hi, Dan. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just fine.
So, you're here to promote a book, I believe. And the book is called Fiscal Follies. Have you published other books, or is this the first one?
I have published before a regional history book and was quite an adventure. And part of the story of that regional history book is told at the very end of Fiscal Follies.
What do you mean regional? Regional history meaning what?
Well, I live in Minnesota, and one of the worst events in Minnesota history occurred back in the 1860s, 1862, the Dakota War, or sometimes called the Sioux Uprising. And quite by accident, I happened upon this wonderful family story of a family that was largely destroyed by that Dakota War, but that never really forgot and kept their family records and kept a genealogy of the four children who survived that day. There were a total of five children and two parents. Um, and I told the story. They had preserved these wonderful family records, handwritten letters from the 1850s and 60s telling their family story. And the records and the photos were so good, the book practically wrote itself. And but inside the story, there is a story of financial history that I wrote about in Fiscal Follies, which is a book that is mostly about economics and finance and the interplay of those subjects with American history and technological history, especially.
Okay, so the war that you're referring to is between white settlers and Native Americans?
Correct, or more precisely, the U.S. government and the Native Americans, specifically the Dakota Indians of southern Minnesota.
The Dakota, yeah, okay. And that ties in with this book somehow?
Well, yes, the story of the war has been told many times, but what is seldom pointed out is the fact that the war resulted in some degree because the Dakota Indians had been promised payment in yearly annuity payment in gold coin. And in the first months of the war, the U.S. government was pretty much run out of its gold reserves. So that months later, when the annuity payment was first made in paper money in what were called greenbacks, the Indians refused the money, and was only later that the government was able to get gold coin to southern Minnesota, but it got there late, got there just hours after the Dakota uprising had begun. It's quite a tragedy. So the story of how the U.S. government and the importance and the centrality of gold to monetary affairs is told in the book, and then becomes part of the story of the Dakota War.
So because they wouldn't accept the paper money, the war started, is what you're saying.
Well,
And
that
or they
among
couldn't,
many other reasons,
yeah.
but the centrality of gold in those days, and the fact that they had every reason to reject the paper money as inferior, is the story I wanted to tell in the in the book.
This book, from what I'm reading through here, is a bit of a sarcastic look.
Yes, a little bit, sure, because in my assessment, economics is not really a science in the same sense that physics and chemistry are science. And what I do in the book is point out some of the errors, the dreadful errors that have been made by economists, pretending to some degree that what they are engaged in is a scientific endeavor. And in many cases, economics has much more to do with human nature and human foibles than it has to do with science, pure science, or in the way that physics and chemistry are science.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I think it's gotten about 100 times worse since people began self trading online when that became available. Because prior to that, you didn't have this mass influx of people trading on the stock market. And the number one cause these days, it seems, of heavy fluctuations on the market is emotion. Has nothing to do with economics.
Right. Some of that is the game of results versus the expectation, certainly. But more broadly, economics, its attempts to manage or micromanage the economy rely on a simplistic notion that the economy is something that can be engineered or managed, and human beings just simply do not behave always in a way that's predictable, and because of that, economics can never really be purely a science.
So the people that you're poking fun at are these people who believe that, or that their job title is economic scientist or something to that
Sure.
effect.
Yeah. And there are examples that go way back to the 19th century. I tell a number of them. The story of how economists kind of came to the rescue, they thought, following the collapse in housing prices in 2008, and that saw such a decline in the economy, and they had this idea that if we just spent $800 billion in a particular way for shovel-ready projects. I don't know if you remember that phrase.
No.
Why we could correct all of these imbalances and get the economy moving again. And the problem with that is that you can't spend that much money on shovel-ready construction projects. That just the system doesn't behave that way. There is all kinds of engineering work that has to be done. The plans have to be vetted by the local communities. It takes years and years to build a new bridge. Anybody who's familiar with the process knows that. So very little of the money was spent in that way, and therefore the economic effects of spending were not at all what was anticipated. Most of the money was used simply to keep government employees on the payroll, government employees at the state and local level who would otherwise have had to be laid off, et cetera, et cetera. It's just not, the system cannot be managed quite as simply as economists try to lead us to believe.
I see some interesting names on here. Karl Marx, the Beatles, Mick Jagger, ABBA, Greta Garbo.
Yes, I talk about all of those people. If you'd like, we can discuss them one at a time.
Well, we've got about 4 minutes, so let's do the Beatles since I'm a big Beatles fan, anyways.
Oh, sure.
So tell me about that one.
Well, you might remember the song "Taxman."
Oh, sure.
Remember? Let me tell you how it will be. The taxman tells, I believe it's John Lennon. He wrote the lyric. There's one for you, 19 for me. Remember that? And that was literally true. In Britain, under the Labour government of the mid-60s, the top marginal tax rate, which is the rate that John Lennon would have paid, the top income tax rate was 95%. That means there's one for John and 19 for the government. That's exactly a marginal tax rate of 95%.
Okay. It was actually George who wrote that song.
Oh, okay.
Just by the way.
I stand corrected.
But he was right, yeah. And they had tax and super tax and tax on tax and all of that. Okay, so the point being for your book
the point is that extremely high marginal tax rates don't work. And they don't work because the people subjected to them either figure out a way to earn less money. In the United States, you can invest in municipal bonds, and then the income on that is tax free, or you do what so many of these big pop stars did back in the 60s. They left the country. That's what the Rolling Stones did.
Yeah,
they
okay.
simply left and went to France.
That's where the ABBA, because I know that all of them left Sweden once they became big superstars.
And the fun story I tell in Fiscal Follies is when they were still in Sweden, they had to figure out a way to deduct a lot of their expenses, because if they showed a profit, it was taxed at a huge amount. So the only way that the clothes that they wore on stage could be deductible was if they were so outlandish as to be useless as street clothing. That was the Swedish rule in the Swedish tax code. So those outfits, those outlandish outfits you see them in the mid 70s, were chosen because for outlandishness, so they would be seen by the taxing authorities to be useless as street clothing, therefore they could be deductible.
There are people that think that corporate taxes should be higher, but the same rule kind of applies, and the effect is the same. When you tax the corporations too high, they move.
Right. It's very tempting for economists to pretend that human beings will just behave and willingly turn over all of this money to the tax man. And they might for a year or two, but I tell you, many of them just leave. And I tell this story in minute detail in the book of how during World War I, the income tax, which was very new at the time, it was only 4 or 5 years old, they decided we have to pay for all of this war spending. The U.S. had just joined the war. So they raised the top marginal rate from about 15% to 75%. And huge numbers of taxpayers simply vanished. They had made a large amount of money in, say, 1916, but by 1918, they no longer made that amount of money. And the government soon figured out it was because they had simply moved their assets, in many cases, into municipal bonds, which were tax-free. And you can see that in the discussions that the senators had in the early 20s. They realized they'd made this boo-boo, this mistake, and they were correcting it in the early 20s when they revised the tax code under the Harding and Coolidge regimes.
Has the book been released?
It has. It came out in October. And it's tough to sell a book with a title having to do with economics, but the people who read it really enjoy it. And I've gotten a lot of nice emails from people through the publisher.
Are you planning on writing a part 2?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right, Dan. Well, listen, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Again, the book is called, can you hold it up?
Yes, Fiscal Follies, a little fun with economics and, in parentheses, and economists, because I have some fun with economists.
Again, thanks for coming on the show. Best of luck with the book. Hope it does well.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.